Welcome to Gambling Harms and Domestic Abuse, resource for housing professionals. I'm Natasha Devon. In this series, we're exploring the intersection between gambling harms and domestic abuse. This is part of a project funded by the Gambling Commission and led by Mercy Denedo from Durham University, in partnership with Amanze Ejiogu from Sheffield Hallam, Chibuzo Ejiogu from Cranfield University, Katy Brookfield from Nottingham University, Liz Riley from Betknowmore UK, and Kelly Henderson from Addressing Domestic Abuse. This is the fourth episode in our series on gambling harms and domestic abuse, with a particular focus on housing. In this episode, we'll be exploring a new resource called Gambling Harms and Domestic Abuse, resource for housing professionals. It's designed to help housing professionals recognise when gambling harms and domestic abuse may be affecting tenants and to understand how to respond safely and effectively. The resource is structured around the 3 R's: recognise, respond, and refer. And in this episode, we look at how housing professionals can respond to people experiencing gambling harms and domestic abuse. It builds on the previous episode, which explored recognising the signs, and now turns to what happens next: how to respond safely, effectively, and with empathy. With me today are Dr. Kelly Henderson from Addressing Domestic Abuse and part of the project's research team, and Nikki Clark, who is Head of Housing at Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse, who work with housing providers and local authorities to improve the housing response for survivors through their DAHA accreditation and whole housing approach frameworks. Welcome to you both. Kelly, I'm going to start with you. Could you tell us a little bit about how this resource came about, what the research involved, and what led you to developing this resource?
Yeah, obviously, we're a partnership of a number of different research organisations, and we knew that there was an issue around domestic abuse in housing, and we wanted to investigate that intersection with gambling harms as well. So we wanted to investigate kind of the impact of gambling harms and domestic abuse on women's housing. And so we wanted to speak to women themselves to find out more about that, but also speak to housing providers and speak to different stakeholders to see really get a feel of what the issue was and the impact that this has on women.
And it took you 2 years, that's right, isn't it, to collate all of this?
Yes, it's been a long, drawn-out process. We want to really take our time and make sure that we did this properly. So what we've done is we've interviewed a number of women. We've interviewed stakeholders, such as police and crime commissioners, health professionals, housing professionals, and we've tried to get as many views as possible to really inform the resource. So what we are developing is a resource for housing providers on gambling harms and domestic abuse. So what we want them to do is to kind of be much better skilled in terms of their response to gambling related domestic abuse or gambling harms and domestic abuse. So the idea is that by working with victim survivors of domestic abuse and housing providers and other stakeholders, we can produce a really helpful resource. So if you're a housing provider, that you're able to kind of use this resource to develop your skills and provide a really good response to a victim survivor of domestic abuse.
That's so important. And when it comes to the respond part, which is what we're looking at particularly in this episode, what guidance does the resource give for housing professionals?
Well, the guidance has lots of background information, but in terms of those practical side of things, we think that's what housing providers need. So in terms of the practicalities, we've identified some case studies, and the case studies kind of follow the resource all the way through. So in terms of responding, we are kind of given advice of, how you would ask questions, how you might spot kind of domestic abuse and how you would then respond to that as well. So, for example, if you've got somebody coming in and you've noticed that that person has rent arrears, maybe there's been lots of repairs in the property, which might point to domestic abuse, that we want the housing providers to feel really informed and skilled to be asking the right questions so that they're asking the questions in a sensitive and empathetic way. and not kind of making the person feel that, oh, well, I better not say anything because I might lose my home if I do disclose this. So in terms of that response, it's about how they ask somebody and in an empathetic way, how they can kind of respond when somebody might make a partial disclosure, such as, oh, I'm really crap with money. He said I'm really bad with the money, so he looks after all of that. Well, that's somebody trying to tell us something. So how do we respond to that? And how do we say, well, can you tell us a bit more about that, or tell us a bit more about what's been happening at home? Who looks after the finances in your home? So that we want them to feel that they do understand the issues, that they can ask the questions in really, as I say, in an empathetic way.
That's so important, isn't it? Because there's so much stigma still, particularly around gambling and gambling harms. I wonder, Nikki, in your experience, what are some of the challenges that housing professionals can face when they're trying to deal with this issue?
I think for housing professionals, a typical housing officer has to be all things to all people that live in their properties. And it's about them very often not having the level of knowledge that around this particular area so they wouldn't necessarily spot it. They wouldn't necessarily see why it was relevant for them to get involved, I think. And training sort of around those sorts of areas doesn't really exist in my experience within housing around the gambling side. It does around domestic abuse. But so I think for that reason, without the resource, providers would be really hesitant to get involved, because if you don't know what you're talking about, you're not going to be confident talking about it. So, and housing professionals are generally really good people, and they would worry about getting it wrong. So I think in the housing world, it's something that's perhaps until this research not been very well understood. And so people could historically have been reluctant to get involved. And likewise, as Kelly said, the stigma side of it from the survivor who's experiencing it, whether it's their gambling or the perpetrators, may be reluctant to sort of bring that out in case they lose their home, because the chances are they will have rent arrears, they will have debts around that. So there would be a reluctance. So it's really important to give those professionals the tools that they need to actually have those good conversations, so those victims and survivors feel supported and able to disclose.
It's so interesting listening to both of you talk about this, because there are echoes, because of my background is in mental health. And for so long, people were frightened of having those conversations because they were scared to say the wrong thing. And it sounds like this is very similar in terms of there being a taboo and people not wanting to go there. So how do you think that this resource could help housing professionals to have that confidence?
I think it's great because it gives that good basic knowledge of what it looks like, where you might see it, and then what you do about it, and where you can sort of help people, how you can help people, how to have those conversations, what you need to ask, what the signs of it are, all of those things. So that's going to improve the confidence immediately. So it's sort of that training resource and everything in one, and then they know where to go if they think, I think that might be an issue. They know where to go to look for it, to get the guidance, to then take that further and help that victim survivor.
And presumably housing professionals are quite often restricted on time as well. Does the resource help them to, I don't mean have the conversation quickly, but kind of lead the person to, be able to open up given the time restraints they have? Yeah,
I think so, because if you've got that knowledge of what you need to ask and you understand the subject in a reasonable amount of sort of level of detail, then you're going to be able to get to the sort of point you need to quicker than if you're trying to fumble your way around something. So, I think it does help them get to there quicker.
Kelly, if there are people listening who, particularly housing professionals, who want to know how they can access these resources, where can they find them?
Yeah, the resource will be on our website, which will be dagamblingharms.co.uk. It's going to be accessible for everybody who, you needn't even be in the housing sector, but hopefully other people will, take a look as well and start to understand the subject of gambling-related domestic abuse in a bit more detail. And as I said earlier, we've got it's really practical advice. So we go from recognising what it might look like, responding, and then finally referring as well. So it's kind of broken down into various stages. So you can click onto the bits that you need. It's going to be fully interactive as well.
And do you think that this it has some advice, this resource, which is applicable outside of the housing sector.
Yeah, I do. I think, as Nikki said, I think we want people to understand the issue. So I think setting out the scene of what gambling and domestic abuse, that intersection of both of these issues together, I think could be useful for a number of different sectors. And whilst we've, really invested our time and our research around housing, domestic abuse and gambling harms and the impact on women, I do think that other people will be able to access the resource as well, definitely.
So just to summarise what both of you have said, when it comes to responding, if you think that there are some indicators that there are gambling harms and domestic abuse, it's about having the confidence to have the conversation, but it's also about asking those questions with empathy.
Yes, definitely.
So it's clear from everything we've discussed today that responding with the right knowledge and empathy can make all the difference. Housing professionals are in a unique position to notice when something isn't right, and knowing what you can do next can be the turning point for somebody's safety and recovery. My thanks to Kelly Henderson and Nikki Clark for joining me today. I'm Natasha Devon, and thank you for listening.